The Parthian Empire viewed itself as the successor to the Achaemenid Empire. The empire's foundation was carved out by an Iranian warrior nomad and his tribe, and it would last almost 500 years. They would rise to become the perfect foil for Rome's eastern ambitions, as the wars they fought prevented each from expanding in the other's direction. This is the rise of Parthia. A clouded dream on an earthly night hangs upon the crescent moon, a voiceless song in an ageless light. And then it draws me far away, where deep in the desert twilight, sand melts in pools of the sky. When darkness lays down her crimson cloak, your lamps will call me home. It has been 80 years since Alexander's forces swept through the Achaemenid Empire and gave chase to Darius III. He had initially sought to avoid direct contact with the Macedonian Greeks, and when he did finally stand his ground to confront them, they would crush his resolve and send him fleeing from the battlefield. Alexander would again give chase, and at Gaugamela, Darius would make what was to be his last stand. There, on the brown, flat fields of what is now Erbil, Iraq, he felt he could present a final and victorious strategy. As before, though, Alexander would not only defeat the Persians, he would rout them from the field completely. Leading the flight was Darius and his inner circle. However, this time, those who surrounded him would not remain loyal. They chose instead to follow their own selfish agendas. Two of these, Bessus and Nabarzanes, would assassinate Darius and throw his body into a common ox cart. Nabarzanes would surrender himself to Alexander, but Bessus, who now took to proclaiming himself as Artaxerxes V, would be captured and then promptly executed by Alexander. Darius, meanwhile, would be afforded a king's burial in the city of Persepolis. Alexander's Greek Empire would go on to annex the remaining territory in Persia before he and his men headed to India, and then his own death just a few years later. Alexander's Greek Empire would stretch even further west and east than the Achaemenid. However, it would be a short-lived empire whose death throes would follow not long after Alexander's own death. He left no recognized heir for succession, and instead his former friends and generals would fight a series of battles in what was known as the Wars of the Diadochi, a conflict that started the year after Alexander's death and would continue on for roughly 40 bloody years. What was once the vast but short-lived Greek Empire would be splintered into multiple possessions and ruled by many of these same men. Despite having married into Iranian families, the majority of Iranian peoples in the lands of the Seleucid Empire viewed the Seleucids simply as foreign occupiers. However, these ancient lands would give rise again to another Iranian empire, one that would in time strike free the Hellenistic shackles. From outside of the dust storm kicked up by these Diadochi battles, a restless tribe of Iranian nomadic peoples led by a warrior king would spring up to challenge the empire left by the Greek invaders, and once again an empire built by Iranian people would rule over these ancient lands. We start our series with the history of that tribe and its journey of conquest. They would transition from nomadic tribesmen to a monarchy before taking the final step into empire building. During the Achaemenid Empire, the region was known as the Satrapy of Parthia. After the fall of Darius and the empire, the region would be ruled by the Seleucid kings. They were a Macedonian dynasty that ruled one of the larger fragments of Alexander's empire, the portion covering land from Bactria and Sogdia to the Aegean coast of Asia Minor. It would be known initially as the Kingdom of Seleucus Nicator, and was founded by its namesake. He was one of the Diadochi, and while the Seleucid Empire as it came to be known would entwine itself with the cultures of the Iranian peoples through conquest, marriage, and heredity, it was an empire founded by the Hellenistic conqueror Alexander, and then held on to by these Diadochi after his death. Parthia benefited from two natural barriers to its north: the mighty Karakum Desert, which occupied about 70% of what we now know as the modern nation of Turkmenistan, and the Kopet Dag mountain range. To its northwest lay Hyrcania, to the west Media, to its east Margiana, and finally to its south Aria, which centered on the present-day city of Herat. In 245 BCE, the Seleucid Satrapy of Parthia, under the rule of its satrap Androgoras, would take up arms against the young Seleucid king Seleucus II Callinicus. He had just been seated on the Seleucid throne. During the confusion of this uprising, the aforementioned tribe, called the Parni, would sweep in from their mountain valley homeland. In time, their homeland of the Fergana Valley and its surroundings would see the rise of another future warrior king, Babur, but that is a story told elsewhere on the channel. The Parni were led by their king Arsaces, and were the last remaining tribe of what had been a confederacy known as the Dahe Confederacy. The other two tribes, the Xanthi and Pisuri, have few remaining sources, and were all but dissolved by the time of King Arsaces. Arsaces took full advantage of the uprising against the Seleucids to further his own expansion ambitions. And in 238 BC, he swept into Parthia at the head of the Parni and overthrew Androgoras, the Seleucid satrap, killing him in the process. That same year, he would be crowned in Asak, and he would make Hecatompolis his capital. The Parni practiced a form of Iranian polytheism, and would over the next decade and century adopt another northwestern Iranian language, Parthian, as their own, just as they would begin to refer to themselves as Parthians. In time, their polytheism would also give way to Zoroastrianism, and its influence would be evident even in the names of Arsaces' successors. However, after his crowning, he would institute other changes that would further separate his now kingdom from the Hellenistic Seleucids. One of the first of these was noted on the first coins that he would issue. They showed him visually dressed in Achaemenid garb, as opposed to the coins of the Seleucids, and referred to him with the Achaemenid title held by its supreme generals. Administratively, Arsaces would lay the foundation of government in a manner very reminiscent of the Achaemenids. He would also continue to expand his territory, which at this time was still a kingdom, and not the empire it would one day become. Next for him was to conquer Hyrcania in 235 BCE. In 231, the Seleucids, who had recovered administratively after the unrest from a few years earlier, attempted to regain control during the reign of Seleucus II. His ambition to restore both Hyrcania and Parthia under Seleucid dominance, but unrest back in Asia Minor, to the west, stayed his hand, and he elected instead to go there. By 228 BCE, the Bactrian ruler Diadochi had conquered the homelands of the Parni and expelled them from the Bactrian territory. Arsaces gathered his forces, and he moved to confront Diadochi. However, as he was moving towards him, he received word of the Seleucids under Seleucus II moving towards his territory. To avoid fighting a war on two fronts, Arsaces concluded a hastily arranged peace treaty with Diadochi. He was also unable to stop the Seleucid momentum and would end up having to flee. He left Parthia, seeking refuge with the nomadic tribes to the north. The Seleucid conquest, though, would turn out to be short-lived, as pressures again in the western Seleucid territories would force Seleucus to leave Parthia. It's been surmised that Arsaces fled perhaps as part of a strategy, knowing the Seleucids would not have the resources to track him, given their other territorial challenges. Arsaces would sweep back into Parthia and reclaim his territories, and even some additional territory to the south. During his last years, Arsaces spent great effort to fortify the towns in his kingdom, and he structured a governmental system as well as levying soldiers and building defensive, strategically placed fortresses throughout his territories. He would also found yet another town, Nisa, which is located in what is now a small town in Turkmenistan. Arsaces would also see coins minted that provide much of the present ruling line information we have about the Parthians. As mentioned previously, his coins purposely featured Achaemenid-type aesthetics, which were an effort to separate his kingdom from the foreign Seleucids. Nisa would also be the location of his mint, where the coins would be made in both silver and bronze. Arsaces would rule until 217 BCE, when he would die and be succeeded by his son Arsaces II. Arsaces' legacy, however, would carry on long after his death. The Parthians lit a permanently lit fire in his honor in the city of Asok that he had founded. The fire would stay lit for more than 2 centuries, and his name would have appended to it the honorific of Father of the Nation, which subsequent Parthian rulers would continue to use. Arsaces' son would also continue to rule the Parthian territory his father had conquered until 209 BCE, when the ambitious Seleucid king Antiochus III, known as the Great, would recapture Parthia. Arsaces II would meet Antiochus in battle after Antiochus, who had already captured the Parthian capital at Hecatompylus, moved to Tagae. They would meet at Mount Labus, where Arsaces was defeated and forced to accept a peace settlement. The terms would be that Arsaces would have to accept feudatory status, and his kingdom would become a vassal state of the Seleucids, who would then move their troops back west. It would be a while before the Seleucids and Parthians would again meet in battle, as Rome, the young republic, was beginning to exert pressure on its neighbors, including the Seleucids' western borders. Arsaces would reign until 191 BCE, before dying, and would be succeeded by a relative named Priapatius. He would have 3 sons who would all rule and considerably expand the Parthian Empire. In Part 2, we will cover the Parthian Empire under his and his son's rule. This concludes the opening episode in the new Parthia Rises series. I hope you enjoyed it. Many more to come. If you like this video, please hit that like button. And if you haven't yet, but you've dropped by and watched some of these videos, consider subscribing. Till the next video, and as always, cheers.